I'm Ron Baker, Director of the Canadian Small Church Ministry Center, sponsored by Small Church Connections here in Canada. And this is us, Canadian Small Churches in Action podcast. Now, today we have a special visitor who lives across the pond and is, I think, probably just enjoying as much beautiful weather as we are here. And so I'm just going to let him tell you a little bit about who he is, where he is, what his ministry journey has been over the years, and we'll just go from there. Talk a little bit about small churches, Jesus, and we'll see where we end up. Sounds great. So take it away.
Take it away. Well, firstly, Ron, thank you for the welcome to the invitation to be on the podcast. Great to be with you. So my name is Andy Bannister. And as you put it, I'm coming from across the pond. So I live in England, in a sort of small town called Swindon. And if anyone listening knows the UK, you take London and go 90 miles west and you'll hit us. So we're in a beautiful rolling part of the countryside with sort of green hills and prehistoric monuments everywhere. I guess I now count as a prehistoric monument. So I turned 50 last year. And I live here with my wife Astrid and our two kids, Christopher and Katrina. The ministry journey, actually, let's answer that one. So I head up an organization called Solas. That's the Scots word, the Gaelic word for light. And so we were originally a Scottish organization, but now kind of UK wide. And really what we do, Ron, is two things. First thing we do is we take the message of Jesus and we take it out of the walls of the churches, be they small churches or medium-sized churches, and we help churches put on events in their local community that engage with people's honest questions about faith. So we help churches put on events in cafes, coffee shops, pubs, curry houses, restaurants, workplaces, universities. We're about to go into university mission season. Lots of Christian campus groups around this time of year do sort of mission weeks, outreach weeks on campus, which we're heavily involved in doing that. And then the other half of what we do is we work with churches to help teach and train and equip their folks to feel confident in talking about Jesus at work, school, at home, with their friends and so on. So I'm now in England. Before I've been here 2 years. Before that, I was in Scotland, where Solas began. So 6 years up in Bonnie, Scotland. And before that, I was in this tiny little country called Canada that you may have heard of. So I did 6 years in Toronto, based in Toronto, working for an organization that sadly now it's not got a good name. It's an organization called Ravi Zacharias Ministries. Back in the day, before we knew there was any problems, it was a great place to work and learn and apprentice. I had the privilege of crisscrossing Canada. So we were talking earlier, you're in Saskatchewan. I have been there several times. I've been to the East Coast, the West Coast, up to the North, down to the South. We loved Canada. In fact, my two kids are Canadian because they were born in Canada. So they have their Canadian passport. So one day they may decide to, leave the UK.
That sounds like a great idea.
So my ministry journey really, that's the sort of summary of it there. I went into full-time evangelism and training and all that kind of stuff in 2010 when I moved to Canada, kind of learnt huge amounts in the Canadian context, and then came back to the UK. And actually there's so many similarities between Canada and the UK. Canada was a great apprenticeship actually for the UK, because a lot of the issues and questions that we found people had in Canada, they're not dissimilar over here. And similar you mentioned small church. I love small churches. I loved working with big churches in Canada, but I also loved going to, tiny, kind of one moose towns in Canada and, here one horse towns and stuff. So Solas, we work with churches that are tiny. And we work with, medium sized and large churches too. But I particularly like the small churches actually, because God is often at work in surprising ways in places that don't always get talked about.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that we have particularly been pushing and trying to help people understand about small churches is that they are significant. And I think
they are.
Over the years, we've sort of been told, well, if unless you're larger, growing number wise, you're in trouble. But the small church can be very significant. And so I guess I'm kind of wondering, as you said, you come from UK and it seems to me over the years, what's happened in UK comes to Canada a number of years later. What do you see is one of the big things that's happening right now that small churches need to be aware of, looking to, particularly as we bring the gospel into our situations?
Well, firstly, by the way, just let me tell you a story to encourage you with small
Okay.
churches. One of the reasons I love small churches is that when I went to theological college in 2000, we ended up going to a very quite small church. At the point we joined, it had about 25 people, and
Mm.
it was a Baptist church. The story was interesting, actually. The pastor was one of our lecturers at the theological college. He'd gone 2 years before when there were 7 people in the church. He was 60. There were 7 people in the church, average age 70. And when Peter turned up as the pastor, he genuinely thought with a church that size and that demographic, his job was to pastor those people through the process of closing that church down and moving them into a more sustainable setting. Because 7 people, average age 70. It was one of the oldest Baptist churches in the country, 1676. So,
Wow.
long history can be quite a painful process. But Peter said very shortly after arriving, they came to him en masse, or 7 of them, and said, Pastor, we're willing to, we don't want our church to close. We're willing to change. We don't mind. We're willing to change. We just don't know what to change. If you lead, we will follow. He's like, okay. And then he said, I had 100% attendance at the church prayer meeting in the middle of the week. All 7 of these elderly saints came. He's like, okay, they pray and they're willing to be led. We can work with this. He then got a few Bible college students in to get some younger blood in there. By the time we came 2 years later, it had grown to 25. When we left 5 years later, it had grown to 120 and
Mm.
is now, 25 years on, a viable congregation. Still smaller, 100, 110 on a
Yeah.
Sunday. But amazing what God's done. And that gave me a love of small churches. And I think there are things that small churches can sometimes do in terms of being nimble and responding to what's going on locally. That a big church would have committees and processes, and it takes a while. What do I see going on in here in the UK that might well hop over to Canada? What excites me right now,
Mhm.
Ron, and friends who are Canadian tell me there are similar patterns going on over there. A lot of, people under the age of, say, 30, maybe even as high as 40, but certainly 30, say, are post Christian in that
Right.
they haven't grown up in a Christian home. Their mum and dad weren't Christian, grandparents weren't Christian, no Christian context at all. But we've moved beyond the kind of very heavy new atheism, heavy secularism of 10, 15 years ago. There is a spiritual openness and hunger out there that I haven't seen for a long time. I think a number of things have triggered it. People are not reacting anymore to Christianity. They haven't grown up in it, so they don't know what it is. But then with all the craziness going on in the world, war in Ukraine, Middle East, Donald Trump predicting World War III, politics,
Yeah.
your politics is in chaos, our politics is in chaos, financial crashes, we've come through the pandemic. I think that's raised all sorts of questions for all sorts of people. And there's a real opportunity for Christians to get into those conversations and engage with people who are spiritually quite interested. And that can work well in small settings, in a setting where the local church is still part of the center of the community, where, one of the things we live in a village. We're outside Swindon, which is a town of 300,000, but our village has, a few thousand people in it. That
Mhm.
means I can walk into the local butcher's shop and I know the guy by name. He knows me by name. You can build those relationships when you're a smaller church and a smaller community. And I think there's huge opportunities actually in the moment we're in. If we try and do what we've always done, I think we will run into a wall. But if we're like, okay, how do we engage with the people that God has placed around us, get conversations about spirituality and faith and the difference it makes going, while taking people's questions seriously, amazing things can happen. And as I get excited, as I cross the UK, the phrase I like to use, Ron, is I see green shoots all over the place. Not
Mm.
mass revival. It'd be lovely to see that. But lots of places I go, there are stories of ones and twos and coming to faith, and churches doing great innovative work, reaching out to those around them. So I think it's an exciting time, actually, to be involved in small church ministry because there are great opportunities. Aslan is on the move, as C.S. Lewis would say.
Yes. Yes. Well, you're bringing up so many questions and so many things that I'm seeing in Canada and trying to understand. Uh, one of the big questions that I think is reverberating in a number of small churches is the question of what is the church.
Hmm.
They're having to deal with that, and then coming to an understanding of church, outside of the building, outside of uh, organized, or as we used to say, institutional church, and trying to figure out what the church is.
Yes.
What would you how would you guide people, as
Mm,
particularly small churches, as they're rethinking this?
yeah. That's a great question, Ron. And I think being willing to sort of take all options, put all options on the table can be helpful. Because one of the dangers, right, is that we get wedded to our church structures, we get wedded to our church buildings and programs and things that look familiar. I think that's the reason why, as human beings, we like the familiar. And sometimes when the Holy Spirit breathes in and does something new, it can be a bit unnerving. That's been the case right back through all of Christian history. But
Hmm.
I would be saying, what are the needs in front of us? What are the community you're trying to reach? And where is the best place to do that? If it's the building on the church corner where you've always met with some things restructured, brilliant. For some churches, that's absolutely right to do
Yeah.
that. Other times it can be right to tear the entire playbook up. I remember years ago, well, 10 years ago now, going to Vancouver Island and coming across a guy there who'd planted a new church out of another church. And they were basically, at that point, using Starbucks. Other coffee shops are available.
Great idea.
But
Yeah.
but what they called it, though, is brilliant. They called it St. Arbucks, which I loved. And they were running Alpha in the coffee shop and doing Bible studies in the coffee shop. And what was great was they'd got, he'd got a community of about 15, 20 people, gathering together at various points in the week. The coffee shop loved him because it was business.
Hmm.
It gave them a presence right there in the community. Now he had no building, which brought its own challenges, but actually amazing work going on. The other model I really intrigued by here in the UK, there's quite a big network now called the Filling Station.
Ah,
There's about 100 of those meetings now, one or two around the world, but mainly in the UK. And what they do is they do monthly Christian gatherings in places like village halls, again, cafes, pubs. There's one I know I spoke at that meets in an art gallery. And what they're really trying to do is, firstly, support small churches. If you're in a village where there's a tiny church, only 5 or 6 of you on a Sunday, it can feel quite lonely. But hey, get together once a month with other Christians and you do a slightly bigger gathering, you feel more impactful. But also to create spaces where it's easy to welcome people, where someone who's
mhm.
had a bad experience of church or no experience of church, rather than say, hey, come to this weird drafty building on the corner, say, hey, why don't you come to the local village community hall on a Wednesday evening? Great cake, great coffee, and community, Jesus preached and so forth, and amazing things happening. But that's required tearing the playbook up and going, what does it look like if we take church out of the doors and
I,
go
I,
somewhere
I,
else? God, sorry.
you're bringing up a question that I wonder about more than once, and that question is, are people ready for that type of come and hang out at the town hall or the city,
Hmm.
as our rural communities say, the community center or whatever? Are they ready for that now? It seemed a number of years ago that was just, we weren't ready for that.
Yeah. Well, there's two questions. There's how Christians respond to that, isn't there, Ron? Of going,
I guess
okay,
so. Yeah.
what if God is calling us to move out of the church and meet in the community? And so
Hmm.
that can work amazingly. I'm intrigued as I travel the UK. I speak in a lot of churches that are still meeting traditionally, but I also ones that are meeting less traditionally. In fact, the church we attend, probably like, I don't know whether we're large or small by Canadian standards. You have some bigger churches. We're about 180 on a Sunday morning.
Hmm.
And what our church did is they bought an old derelict. They bought an old derelict factory. It was a built so an old factory was going to get demolished. Church bought it and converted it, and it's very unconventional space, but it works actually fantastically. And actually, what's in my kids love it because you come in on the middle floor, and the way you get to the ground floor to the quote unquote sanctuary is if you're a young person, you take a slide. They've built a slide that goes from the entrance level to the, and the result is the kids think it's fantastic, but it's a totally non-conventional space. But for us, it's working because it's right in one of the areas of Swindon that is growing. So you've got a church right there in the community. But to do that, we had to something that didn't look like church. In terms of our non-Christian friends, I would say there's huge openness. We do so many of these events around the country here in the UK. And actually, I learned this model in Canada. Towards the end of our time there, we began doing this, where I would say to churches, look, find a focal point in the local community. I mentioned a certain coffee shop chain, Starbucks, earlier.
Yeah.
I'm not on commission to mention it again, but I forget the chap who founded that. But the guy who founded that talked about wanting to create a third space between home and work. That was the idea. It wasn't work, it wasn't home, it was a third space. And that was their business model. And then when I came across that thinking, that's a very interesting metaphor for evangelism.
Hmm.
Because what does it look like as Christians if we find those third spaces? It's not the church, it's not equally not someone's home, but it's somewhere in the middle. And we do loads of events with churches where we say, find that third space, a cafe, a coffee shop. England has a big pub culture. That's not so common in Canada, but
Yeah.
there are equivalents. Rent the space because then you're blessing a local business by paying them for the evening. Put on good food. That we find is a good invitational thing. And Canadians like you're like Brits. We like a
Oh,
snack.
yeah,
We're
yeah.
more cake, you're more donuts. I miss my Timmies.
Yes.
And but put on that kind of stuff so that people feel the hospitality is good. Take a topic that people are interested in. So like next Saturday night, I'm speaking for a church, an event like one of these. They're using the local golf club because it's the best venue for their small community. And so we're going to have a lovely slap up meal. And I'm standing up and doing a 15-minute talk on where is hope in a world of chaos.
Mm.
And I'm going to, talk about the world of chaos is not difficult right now.
Yes,
I'm going
for
to sort of
sure.
set out some of the really a bit of how bleak it is if we're just atoms and particles, and then gently suggest that actually Christian faith offers a God who actually not just offers us hope, but knows what this world is like. He stepped into the person of Jesus. We'll have Q&A afterwards, and I have high confidence that would be a great event because people are saying it's easy to invite their friends. He'd say, "I bought you a ticket for a meal on Saturday night. We've got steak dinner and a piece of dessert and a cup of coffee and a speaker." But yeah, we learned the first time I did an event like that was in Montreal, where we used a cafe because cafe culture is big in Montreal, and we packed the place out, standing room only. So I think our non-Christian friends, if you get the question right and the hospitality right, those two things together, then I think, yeah, amazing things can happen.
I think you're touching on one thing that certainly small churches are really good at, and you've talked about it earlier in this podcast, the whole relationship versus big organization and
Hmm.
that type of flow chart type of thing. Is as I look at a number of things that are happening in small churches and even across Canada and in the small town that I live in, the question still is, can we take some of the older, and I'll say this quite honestly, a number of small churches have thrived off of older people that came
Hmm.
together. They had an affinity 50 years ago, and now that affinity continues, but they're all dying. There's an attrition that's happening. What would you suggest for churches like that, that know that something has to happen,
Hmm.
but they're all dying off?
Yeah. Well, the first thing I would say, and I want to be careful not to be simplistic, because it's very easy
No,
for people,
that's fine.
for you and I to sit here and pontificate, and people go, "Hang on a minute." That story I told of the church I was in, 20 years ago, Cheney's Baptist Church, in a very rural part of England, that really showed me what can be done. So one of my lessons from that is if you are in a congregation like that, make sure that you are genuinely open to change.
Mm.
Make sure that you are praying. That's the starting point. Because if you're wedded on to this is the way we've always done it, we can't change this. These meetings, these structures are carved in stone. That is dangerous because Christians, we have this horrible sort of tendency to, we find something the Holy Spirit is doing, and then we sort of build a gilded cage around it. And the Holy Spirit flits through the bars, and we're left with something that may have worked 20 years ago, but no longer now. So be genuinely, willing to be praying, to be listening to the Lord, because that opens up all kinds of possibilities. I think that's the first thing. Secondly, of course, I'm a great believer in that actually every generation needs Christ. I feel this even more now because I turned 50, last year. And and so I guess I count as middle-aged. So one of the things I'd be saying is just because you've got an older demographic, that's not necessarily inherently a problem because there's an older demographic in your community who are going to need reaching for Christ. So I think a great starting point for any church is who are the people that God has placed around you? Who are the people that you're interacting with? Is it retirees? Is it people in the workplace? Is it young families? Who are the people God's placed around you and your network of people? One exercise, by the way, that I always find helpful for churches to do is sit down as a group, whether you're large or small, and just make a list of the people that you interact with in a typical week. If it's a more a working age congregation, it'll be the workplace stuff. If it's older, maybe you're interacting with grandparents, children, other retirees, your next door neighbors. Who are those people? And how, as a church, can you be serving them? And by the way, sometimes it could be as simple as asking people, to sort of do a little survey in your community of going, we are whatever Baptist church. Is there anything that you think this community needs? Because being an older congregation, there are still things that you can do, some things you can't do, but there are some things I think that you can do. And then the other thing I would say is that if you do have younger folks in your community. And young is a relative definition, I realize.
Definitely. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I'm very careful how I describe that, because maybe people listening to this in their 60s going, well, that's me, I'm young. But if there are, younger folks in your congregation, one of the things I find sad sometimes is when you get this division between the young and the old,
Mm.
and that the church isn't pulling together and working together. And actually, looking back, one of the things in that experience that I talked about 20 years ago that I think really stood out as a hallmark is the old folks who were such wonderful prayer warriors, but they did a really good job also of mentoring the younger ones. So can we be pairing people together? Let's get people in their 70s praying for people in their 30s. Let's not be separating things, because when it's working great, the younger ones bring the energy and perhaps the creativity, but the older ones bring wisdom, perhaps a more mature understanding of scripture, perhaps a deeper prayer life. Well, let's plug those things together and God can work in amazing ways.
Okay, I'm going to jump to a whole different, I'll call it North American context, perhaps even Canadian context. You're turning 50. If you go back 50 years and then take 50 years back from that, you hit the 1970s with the Jesus people.
You
You
do.
hit the 1920s with a whole, I'll call it variant group, various, a group of young people growing up saying, we need Jesus. Do you see that happening once again? Is there a, I don't want to call it a historical cycle, but perhaps.
Yeah,
Um,
there is a there's a question.
yes, it is.
Yeah. Well, I'm reflecting on it because one thing I've heard several people say in recent weeks, and when you hear different people say the same thing, you begin to think, oh, is there a sort of God thing going on here? One of the dangers is, isn't it, I think, Ron, that sometimes we disconnect evangelism from discipleship.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember a pastor saying to one of my colleagues recently, just made a sort of remark. He said, when I look around my church, the people who are the most fervent in evangelism are the most committed in terms of discipleship. They're the ones working the hardest to really follow Christ, because I think then evangelism flows out of that. And conversely, those whose discipleship is sort of all over the place, perhaps are quieter. And I think sometimes we've forgotten that. Those of us who are passionate evangelists, we forget the need for the discipleship piece, and if we're not careful, we can end up with sort of shallowness underneath. And conversely, we can sit there going, okay, what's the church growth strategy for a church of 25 people, without going, well, maybe it begins with making sure that we go really deep. And you could go back further than you've quoted there, 1920 and stuff. If you go back in time here in the UK, and I'm sure there are equivalents in Canada, I look at some of the great revivals
Mm-hmm.
here. In the 16th, 17th century, you've got Wesley, you've got
Yes.
Welsh revival in the 1800s. Those things, they were all birthed out of prayer. They all began when people began fervently praying, and out of that stuff, suddenly something happened. So there's a connection there, which means I think those movements that you mentioned are not accidental. I want to say I don't see evidence of that. When I say that, it sounds really negative. I don't see
No.
evidence of a movement of that today. I do see a lot of really passionate young people. I have the privilege, I mentioned university mission weeks and things, got a privilege of getting involved in lots of those. I love seeing young people absolutely on fire for Jesus and stuff, but I don't see a kind of movement like those things. And maybe that's something to be praying for, because you
What
do see when those things hit,
what would a
incredible things.
prayer movement look like?
I don't know.
In
That's a great question, isn't it?
yeah,
I love to, that's good, actually. I don't know the answer
I
to
don't
that.
either.
What I will say, I'll tell you what does interest me
Okay,
on this. Just it's a slight tangent, but you throw tangents at me, Ron, so I'm going to
that's
throw a
right.
tangent right
Okay.
back at you. I was very struck by I think last year I was in Canada, 2016. There was a piece of work done by, I think it was the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada, commissioned a report called Hemorrhaging Faith. I don't know if you came across
Yes.
this.
Yeah.
This brilliant. That report, if you remember, it looked at the fact that 70% of young people who go to university who's Christian tragically walk away from their faith, right? About 30% carry on. But what Hemorrhaging Faith did that was really interesting is, rather than look on the 70, why did they leave? It flipped it round. It looked at the 30%. Why did they stay? How do we
Mm-hmm.
build resilient Christians? And I will still remember that two of the big takeaways for building young people who are really on fire for Christ through those university years and beyond. Number one on the list, I think number one on the list, was was basically what we might call apologetics, was helping young people
Right.
see there are good answers to their questions, encouraging questions. Churches that have really struggled, I think, have been churches that give people the impression your questions don't matter. So take questions seriously. That actually applies to any age, but especially to young people. But the other one that really stuck with me, and I'm praying that we'll get the opportunity to deploy this with our children when they come of age, is when young people go on short-term mission, when you have to actually go and do something risky and exciting for Jesus. And I wonder whether that's part of the answer to your question. If we just live very safe lives, that we go to church on Sunday, maybe a midweek Christian event, then we do our jobs or our hobbies or whatever, Monday through Friday, we don't take any risks for God. There's never any point where we actually need to rely on him because it's so safe and so comfortable. Canada, like the UK, we've got a great welfare system. We don't need to worry about health particularly because the state will step in and coddle us and everything. So life becomes so risk-free. But I think when you have to rely on God and you really have to start praying like Billy O, going, if God doesn't come through, we are really up a gum tree here. Actually, is an Australian metaphor, not up a creek is a Canadian
Okay.
metaphor. And so I wonder, part of the question is that how do we encourage a culture of risk taking? And that's a question for if your congregation has an average age of 70 or an average age of 17,
Yeah.
actually, because you know what, sometimes you might fall flat on your face. The history of missions has had things that have where God has gone, no, I'm going to let that fall.
Yeah.
But I think prayer is when you really have to pray or you've got nothing else left. Then I think
yeah. So sort of
something
the idea of unless it's impossible, don't bother doing it, because get God in on it.
almost that kind of thing,
Yeah.
right? And and that may look different for every
I,
congregation. One of my Canadian friends who was a pastor used to like, I mean, it's not unique to the church, but he used to like, he introduced me to the phrase, BHAGs, big, hairy, audacious goals.
yes.
And going, sometimes in prayer, we need those of going, let's do something bold as the church, let's go and do a leaflet drop to the entire community, invite them to the Christmas Carol service. Who knows what may happen? We might get lots of doors thrown in our face and called all kind of rude names, but you never know. God might work through it. But we're going so I think creating BHAGs and praying into them.
I'm watching. I do some teaching as well in a Bible college setting. I'll call it a ministerial training setting. And one of the things that I've watched over the last few years is the move from just merely being in class to having a short class time, prep, complete assignments, and then spend time actually for the last part of a 3-week session going out and doing something, being in ministry, and as you say, taking a risk, because I'm watching some of these students and thinking, I don't know how they're going to do this, but they come back with great stories, and the stories are not about how great they are, but about how great God is. And so I wonder,
I think you're right. And in my, I look back on my own sort of spiritual journey. I mean, I told you some of the ministry story, but really where, evangelism and apologetics kicked off for me was in the late 1990s. I got persuaded to go to a place called Speaker's Corner. That's part of one of our big parks in London, where you can stand on a ladder or a soapbox, talk about anything, get a crowd. I met a chap who was going there to do outreach to Muslims, and in a moment of madness, I agreed to come along and try street preaching to hundreds of Muslims. Never talked to a Muslim before, never stood on a ladder before and preached, never preached on the street before. I mean, to go talk about a BHAG, and the first few weeks was an utter disaster. But actually, boy, did I have to pray because I had absolutely nothing. And actually, I now look back on that as one of the most formative experiences of my life because I learned an incredible amount. But in particular, I learned if God's not behind it, it's probably not worth doing it.
yeah,
But it's an interesting question for all of us, I think, Ron, listening to this, wherever we are. I think all of us can ask, okay, Lord, where are my comfort zones? Where are the places I'm most, if I'm honest, I'm naturally inclined to go, no, I wouldn't be willing to do that. And then think about stepping beyond them, and not on your own,
yeah.
do it in community. And the great thing is, if you're a small church of even 3, 4, 5 people, you could sort of share that with your friends, ask your friend to pray for you. So I'm going to try something a bit daring. I'm actually really scared about this. Would you pray with me? And see what God does.
I think that's marvelous. Now, unfortunately, we're at the end of our time just about here.
It goes quick, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's gone very quick. Very quick. So I'm going to this the same question that I ask others that I do podcasts with. If you had one piece of advice for a small church pastor, leader, someone in taking on a role and responsibility in a small church, what would that be? Just one piece.
Well, yes. Let me give you one piece of advice and then just flesh it fractionally. The piece of advice I would give is a piece of advice that was given to me by a friend who was given to him. And the piece of advice is this: don't worry about the breadth of your ministry. Let God worry about that. You worry about the depth. So it's
Mm,
very easy when you're in a small church setting or a small ministry setting, any ministry setting, to think, oh, I need to get bigger and do all these crazy things. We live in a culture that says breadth, breadth, breadth. But I think God says depth, depth, depth. And the great thing is that's the piece you can to some degree control. You can put the time and the effort into pursuing the Lord, to going deep in your faith and in your ministry, and making sure the foundations are really good. And then you can trust the Lord. And if God wants you to reach the entire town, that will happen. If he just wants you to reach the immediate neighborhood, that will happen. And I think where we get depressed sometimes in ministry is we set our sights on horizons that the Lord may not have for us. So don't let God worry about the breadth of your ministry. You worry about the depth.
fantastic. Andy, thank you. Thank you very much
You're
for
very welcome. It's
spending
been a
time with us.
fantastic conversation. Always great to talk to a Canadian. We miss the country tremendously.
Thanks again.
God bless.